found her before I found the letter, and it was the letter that nearly got us both killed. It was October of 1885, and I had been riding the high plains of Wyoming Territory for 3 days straight, moving cattle nobody had hired me to move, just trying to outrun a debt I owed a man in Cheyenne who collected in ways that left marks. The storm caught me at the Sweetwater crossing an hour past dark, and I was still deciding whether to make camp or push through when I heard it. Not the thunder, not the river, which was running high and mean and the color of coffee. A baby crying somewhere out past the current, thin and furious and getting farther away with every second I stood there deciding. There was a wagon in the river. I could see it now that my eyes had found the shape of it, tipped on its side against a snag of cottonwood roots, one wheel still spinning slow in the current, though it hadn't caught up to the axle being broken, no driver that I could see, no horse. Just the wagon, and the crying, and the water rising an inch at a time against a canvas already half torn loose. I didn't think it through. I went into that river the way you go into a fight you can't win clean because the alternative is worse than losing. The current took my hat first, then near took my boots, and by the time I got a hand on the wagon's side rail I understood why the horse was gone. Lightning had likely spooked it out of the traces. I hauled myself onto the tipped bed and found her wedged where the floor met the side wall, wrapped in a grey wool blanket that had kept most of the water off her by pure luck and nothing else. 3 months old if she was a day, red-faced and screaming with the particular fury of something too young to know it was already fighting for its life. I got her out from under a trunk that had shifted and was leaning close enough to crush her, tucked her inside my coat against my chest, and went back into the water with one arm because I didn't have a second one to spare. I don't remember the whole swim back, only the cold going to the bone and the baby going quiet part way through, which frightened me worse than her crying had. I got my boots under me in the shallows and checked her the way you'd check a foal, for breath, for warmth. She was. She looked up at me with eyes that hadn't decided what color they were going to be yet, and she was, God help me, entirely calm about the whole business, like she'd already concluded that the worst of it was over and saw no need to keep complaining. I looked back at the wagon. There was a trunk in there and whatever else the river hadn't claimed yet, and somewhere under all of that, most likely, the person who'd been driving. I went back twice more before the current took the wagon apart and swept it downstream in pieces. I never found a body. I want that said plainly because it matters to what came after. I never found her mother, if that's who she was, not that night and not in the weeks that followed. The river had taken her clean, the way it takes most things it decides to keep. My name is Elias Marrow, and at 30 years old I had exactly nothing to my name but a horse, a debt, and now, apparently, a baby. I'd grown up the second son on a spread in the Nebraska panhandle, too small for 2 sons, drifting cattle work since 17, careful never to want anything permanent, because permanent things were what got taken from you. I had a brother once, Micah, younger than me by 2 years, and it was my job to watch him the summer he drowned in the North Platte when I was 15, looking the other way for the length of time it takes a boy to go under. I have not gone near moving water in 15 years without Micah standing beside me. So understand that part of me was thinking of him the whole swim, and part of me had already decided not to stand on a bank and watch again. I rode into Larkspur, Wyoming Territory, near dawn with the baby wrapped against me and no earthly idea what a man does with an infant that isn't his. The town had maybe 400 people, and it was the blacksmith's wife who told me, half frozen and desperate, that I wanted Wren Halloway. Wren Halloway was 27 and had been the closest thing Larkspur had to a midwife since her husband Simon died of a lung fever 2 winters back, leaving her a small house at the edge of town and a skill she'd learned at her mother's side in Ohio. She answered in a wrapper, hair still in its night braid, took one look at what I was carrying and pulled me inside without a question. She had the baby out of my coat and onto a warmed blanket by the stove before I'd finished explaining what little I knew, a wrecked wagon, no mother found. A child close to 3 months old, underfed but, remarkably, in good health. Wren worked while I talked, checking the baby's breathing and color and the soft spot at the crown of her head with the economical calm of a woman who had done this 100 times and would not be hurried by my panic. "She's going to be fine," Wren said, which was the first complete sentence she'd offered me, and it did more for me than anything else that night. You did right by her. I was exhausted past my body. Wren gave me dry clothes that had belonged to her husband, and by sunup I had told her about the debt in Cheyenne and my brother Tom, because a man who has just pulled a baby from a flooding river has little pride left to protect. Wren took foundlings. It was not unusual in Larkspur, not with the territory still filling the gaps the Desert Land Act had left behind. Claims that failed as often as they held, children orphaned by fever and accident faster than anyone liked to admit. She had 2 other foundlings placed with families already that autumn. She did it, she said, because somebody had to, and because she had the milk of a woman who'd lost her own child before Simon died and never stopped grieving the waste of it. I should have ridden on. I told myself I would, once the baby was settled and safe. I stayed instead, 3 days, then a week, telling myself it was to make sure she was truly well, when the plain truth was that I did not want to leave a house that had taken me in as easily as it had taken in the child. It was on the 4th day, while Wren was unwrapping the grey wool blanket to wash it properly for the first time, that she found the letter. It had been sewn into the blanket's lining, folded small and wrapped in oiled cloth to keep the water out, which told me plainly that whoever had put it there had done so with care, expecting the blanket might end up somewhere the rest of the wagon didn't. Wren brought it to me at the kitchen table with the stillness of a woman who has read something she was not prepared for. The hand was a woman's, careful and educated. My name is Naomi Steele. If you are reading this, something has happened to me before I could finish what I set out to do, which was to bring my daughter to her father's family, whether they want her or not. Her father is Nathaniel Ashworth, and he is dead now near a year, thrown from a horse before he ever knew I was carrying his child, and I have waited too long out of pride and fear to do anything about it, and I am done waiting. Her name is Faith. She is an Ashworth by blood if not by law, and Cornelius Ashworth of the Circle A, whatever he thinks of me, owes this child the truth of who she is. I am asking whoever finds this to see that she gets to him. I am asking you to not let his pride bury her the way it near buried me. I set the letter down and looked at the baby asleep in the basket by the stove, and I understood, in the way you understand a thing about to cost you something, that I had pulled more out of that river than a child. Cornelius Ashworth owned the Circle A, which was not so much a ranch as it was most of the county. 40,000 acres he'd built up over 20 years of buying out or squeezing out every small outfit unlucky enough to share a fence line with him. His only son, Nathaniel, had been thrown from a horse that November and died of it 3 days later, and Cornelius Ashworth had, by every account I'd heard in Larkspur, gone into that grief like a man closing a door and locking it. A cattle baron with no living heir was a particular kind of dangerous. Word travels fast in a county that's small. Within the week, a rider came through Larkspur asking after a wrecked wagon at the Sweetwater crossing, a woman traveling alone, anything anybody might have seen. His name, I learnt soon enough, was Otis Graves, and he ran the Circle A's less official business, the kind that didn't get written down in any ledger, and he had a way of asking questions that made it clear the answers mattered to him considerably more than he was letting on. He came to Wren's door on a Tuesday evening while I was out at the well. I came around the corner of the house to find him standing on her porch with his hat still on, which in that country was its own kind of insult, and Wren in the doorway with her arms crossed and Faith nowhere in sight, because Wren had the good sense, the moment she'd seen a stranger's horse on the road, to put the baby in the back room under a quilt. I heard him tell her he'd heard she'd taken in a foundling from the river crossing, and I heard Wren tell him, level-voiced, that Larkspur had a number of widows who took in children and she didn't see what business it was of his which one. Graves looked past her into the house, then at me, coming up the path with a bucket in my hand and nothing else, and said that Mr. Ashworth had a particular interest in any child that might have come out of that wreck, and it would go easier for everyone if we brought her to the Circle A ourselves rather than made him come back with more men and less patience. I did not sleep that night. I sat up in Wren's kitchen with the letter in my coat pocket and thought about a man with 40,000 acres and a dead son and a great deal to lose if the wrong story got told about how that son had spent his last year alive. I thought about what a man like that might decide to do with an inconvenient granddaughter if he could make the problem disappear before anyone in the county heard Naomi Steele's name attached to his. Wren found me still sitting there at first light, Faith asleep against my chest because neither of us had wanted her out of arm's reach since Graves had ridden off, and she looked at me with the exhaustion of a woman who has spent a night doing the same arithmetic I had, and said the thing out loud I had not yet let myself say. We can't wait for him to come back with more men, Elias. We go to him first, or we lose the chance to say anything at all. We went to the Circle A 3 days later, both of us, because Wren would not let me go alone and I would not let her go without me. And we brought Faith, because whatever waited for us at that ranch house, I had decided somewhere in the sleepless dark of the night before that I was done letting other people decide what happened to a child I had pulled out of a river with my own 2 hands. The Circle A main house was the largest building I had seen outside of Cheyenne. 2 stories of milled lumber and glass windows sitting in the middle of grassland that ran to every horizon. Cornelius Ashworth met us on the porch with a face like weathered stone and a silver-tipped cane he did not appear to need for walking so much as for emphasis. He looked at Wren and at me and at the bundle in her arms and said, before either of us had gotten a word out, that he did not know what con we were running, but he had buried one Ashworth that year already and did not intend to be made a fool of over a stranger's child. I gave him the letter instead of an argument. I had learned by then, watching Wren with frightened animals and frightened people both, that some things are better shown than told. He read it standing on his own porch with the Wyoming wind pulling at the paper, and I watched a man built out of 40 years of not letting anything touch him try and fail to keep his face from moving. He knew the handwriting. I understood that from the way his hand went still part way through, the way a man's hand goes still when a ghost has just walked directly at him. Naomi Steele, he said finally, like the name itself weighed something. Nathaniel wrote to me about her once. I told him an Ashworth didn't marry a school teacher's daughter with no name behind her, and he never mentioned her again, and I thought that meant he'd listened to me. He looked at the baby for a long time, longer than I think he intended to, because something in his face was doing the arithmetic that grief does, counting backward from a death to everything that came before it that a man wishes he could take back. He didn't listen to me. He just stopped telling me things. I told him then about Micah, because I did not know another way to say what I meant, and because a man who has carried his brother's death like a stone in his coat for 15 years understands the difference between grief and pride, and how easily one gets mistaken for the other. I told him I had gone into that river without thinking because I was done watching people I might have saved go under while I stood on a bank deciding whether it was my place to move, and that whatever he decided about his granddaughter, I hoped he would decide it fast, because pride was a slow-moving flood too, and it drowned people just the same, only quieter, with nobody around afterward to say they'd tried to pull anyone out. Cornelius Ashworth stood on his porch a long time without saying anything at all, looking at the child who had his dead son's mouth, I would learn later, though I could not have told you that myself in that moment. Then he asked, in a voice considerably smaller than the one he'd met us with, if he could hold her. He held her like a man who had forgotten, or never quite learned, how careful a thing an infant is, stiff-armed and uncertain, and Faith looked up at him with the same calm assessment she'd given me that first night in the river shallows, like she'd already decided the worst of whatever this was had passed, and saw no need to make a fuss about the rest of it. Something in Cornelius Ashworth's face came apart, quietly, the way ice goes on a pond in March, not all at once, just enough that you know the rest is coming. He did not, in the end, take her from us. I want that understood plainly, because I know what a man with his money and his pride might have been expected to do, and it is not what happened. He asked instead, with a humility I would not have believed him capable of on that first hard-faced meeting, whether Wren would consider raising Faith at the Circle A's expense, in Larkspur, in the house she already knew, with him permitted to visit as her grandfather and nothing forced faster than any of us, Faith included, was ready for. He said he had already lost one chance to know somebody he loved because his pride had gotten in front of his sense, and he did not intend to make that mistake twice in one lifetime. Wren said yes. I stayed in Larkspur to see it settled properly, and then I stayed longer than that because Wren Halloway's kitchen had become, somewhere in those weeks, the first place in 15 years of drifting that I had wanted to wake up in twice in a row, and because the debt in Cheyenne turned out to be a problem Cornelius Ashworth resolved with a single letter and considerably less trouble than I'd spent 2 years dreading. He did it, he told me plainly, because a man who pulls a baby out of a flooding river does not deserve to spend the rest of his life running from a debt collector over a bad card game, and because family, once you finally understood what the word cost, was not a thing you let go cheap on either side of it. I asked Wren once, that winter, sitting at her kitchen table with Faith asleep in the cradle Cornelius Ashworth had sent over from Cheyenne, carved with more care than a hard old man like that had any business showing, whether she'd known, that first night I came pounding on her door soaked through and half out of my mind, that I was going to end up staying. She said she'd known before I did. She said most people did when it came to the things that mattered, and that the trouble was never really the knowing. It was always just working up the nerve to say it out loud before the river took the chance away. I think about the wagon sometimes, still out there somewhere in pieces along the Sweetwater. I think about how a river can take everything from a person and still, somehow, if you go in after it, hand something back. Faith never knew her mother's face, but she grew up knowing her name and knowing it was spoken with love in every house that claimed her, and I have come to believe that is its own kind of enough.